Welcome back to Nutrition 101. This course follows Sizer and Whitney's Nutrition, Concepts and Controversies 16th edition, but I've made adjustments by skipping and rearranging some of the material and adding my own images and information. This video covers Chapter 4, the carbohydrates, sugar, starch, glycogen, and fiber, which begins our journey into the 3 macronutrients. The learning objectives for this lesson are to examine the 4 types of carbohydrates, explain why carbohydrates are needed in the diet, discuss nutrition recommendations for carbohydrates, and explore the basics of carbohydrate metabolism, emphasizing digestion, absorption, and storage. Carbohydrates can be defined as compounds composed of single or multiple sugars. Plants generate them through photosynthesis, a process in which they use sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to create the energy they need to grow and thrive. Humans then consume carbohydrates by eating the whole plant, eating food produced by the plant, or eating food produced by humans that contains components of it. All carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that's where the name comes from. Carbo represents the carbon, and hydrate represents the combination of hydrogen and oxygen. Furthermore, all carbohydrates are classified as simple and complex, which indicates their molecular structure only and does not indicate their healthfulness. Simple carbohydrates include sugars, and complex carbohydrates include starch, glycogen, and fiber. Those are the 4 major types of carbohydrates that are the focus of this first learning objective. First, we'll spend some time looking at the sugars. The sugars include monosaccharides and disaccharides. Monosaccharides are single sugar units, while disaccharides are 2 single sugars linked together. Put simply, mono means 1 and di means 2. There are 3 monosaccharides and 3 disaccharides. Glucose, fructose, and galactose are the monosaccharides. Maltose, lactose, and sucrose are the disaccharides. Notably, each of the disaccharides is made up of monosaccharides. For example, the disaccharide sucrose includes glucose and fructose molecules. Here are the 6 sugars. The disaccharides are on top, and then you can see the monosaccharides they're composed of on the bottom. Maltose includes 2 glucose molecules, lactose includes glucose and galactose molecules, sucrose includes glucose and fructose molecules. Some additional information about the sugars I'd like you to know is that glucose is the most important sugar in the human body. That's because it's used for energy by all the body's tissues. In fact, it's so crucial that the body converts galactose and some fructose to glucose. That conversion occurs in the liver. I'd also like you to know that sucrose is a significant source of added sugars in the diet. Those are sugars that are added to a food or beverage when it's being made or processed. They're problematic because they add calories without contributing much to feelings of fullness or to the vitamin and mineral content. Sucrose occurs naturally in foods like sugarcane, dates, and honey. However, it's also extracted and processed to create table sugar, which is the crystalline form we see most often. So, sucrose is just the fancy name for the white or brown sugar you see in packets or jars. Lastly, I want you to know about lactose and lactose intolerance. Lactose is also known as milk sugar because we find it in dairy products. It's the only sugar that's of animal origin. The others originate from plants. You're likely aware of lactose because more than 1/3 of the US population has lactose intolerance, and they need to be careful with their intake of dairy products. Lactose intolerance is caused by insufficient production of the digestive enzyme lactase, causing the lactose to pass through the small intestine without being broken down into individual monosaccharides. That leads it to entering the large intestine, where it's feasted on by intestinal bacteria. This process often results in nausea, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and excessive gas. Once again, lactose consists of a glucose molecule and a galactose molecule. With adequate lactase production, humans split lactose into its individual monosaccharides, which are then absorbed into the bloodstream in the small intestine. However, with insufficient lactase production, the lactose passes through the small intestine undigested and unabsorbed, leading to the large intestine where it serves as food for intestinal bacteria. Its presence in the intestines draws water into the digestive tract, and bacteria feasting on it leads to gas production. That's it for the sugars for now. We'll now move on to the complex carbohydrates, starch, glycogen, and fiber. All of these complex carbohydrates are polysaccharides. So, instead of being one or two sugar molecules, they can be thousands of molecules in length and are made of glucose only. Each polysaccharide has a unique structure and function. Starch is the storage form of glucose in plants. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose in animals. Fiber makes up the leaves, stems, and seeds of plants. Looking a bit closer at the polysaccharides, we can see they're all made of glucose molecules but come in different arrangements. Starch and glycogen are stored glucose in plants and animals respectively. Later in the lesson, we'll see how our body is able to break down those strands and use the glucose within them. Fiber is a structural component of plants, and the glucose molecules of fiber are arranged so that our body is unable to break the bonds that hold them together. Some additional information about starch I want you to know is that grains, legumes, and vegetables are significant dietary sources. Grains include any bread, pasta, or cereal made from wheat flour, and starchy vegetables include potatoes and corn. Then, regarding glycogen, I want you to know that it's stored in the liver and skeletal muscle and is not found in any detectable amount in plant or animal-based foods. The animals we eat have glycogen when they're living, but it rapidly dissipates as soon as the animal dies. Finally, for fiber, I want you to know that it cannot be digested by human digestive enzymes. It passes through the digestive tract mostly undigested. It therefore does not provide the same amount of energy as sugars or starch. Fiber serves as food for bacteria in the large intestine. As I mentioned in Chapter 3, the intestinal bacteria produce energy, vitamin K, and B vitamins that we benefit from. Nevertheless, their feasting on it also produces gas that contributes to bloating and flatulence. This can be a side effect of increasing consumption of fibrous foods or having an overall excessive fiber intake. Okay, that completes the first learning objective. Examine the 4 types of carbohydrates. Now I'll explain why carbohydrates are needed in the diet. For this section, we're asking ourselves, what do carbohydrates do? Carbohydrates have numerous functions in the body and play a critical role in optimizing human health. First, glucose is a valuable energy source in the body. It's the exclusive energy source for red blood cells, which we need to carry oxygen in the bloodstream. It's also the preferred energy source for the brain and central nervous system. Second, sugar-protein complexes play a vital role in the functioning of tissues. For example, sugars help to create the mucus that lubricates the respiratory tract and digestive tract. And third, glycogen serves as an important energy reserve. Liver glycogen helps to maintain blood glucose levels between meals, and muscle glycogen supports the energy demand of physical activity. The remainder of the functions for carbohydrates are unique to fiber, which offers multiple benefits to humans. Fiber promotes feelings of fullness after meals, which can help to prevent excessive energy intake. Fiber slows glucose absorption, helping to avoid the large spikes and dips in blood sugar that can lead to higher levels of hunger and lower levels of energy. Fiber eases the elimination of feces, reducing the burden and consequences of constipation. Fiber prevents cholesterol reabsorption, which can help prevent or treat high blood cholesterol and thus lower the risk of heart disease. As mentioned previously, fiber also serves as food for intestinal bacteria, and those bacteria are beneficial to human health. This image shows the contrast between feces when there's adequate fiber intake and inadequate fiber intake. Fiber adds bulk to the feces by presenting material the body cannot digest. It also holds on to water, making it softer and easier to move along the digestive tract. Conversely, inadequate fiber intake can result in dry, hard stool that's difficult to pass. That can lead to pain, discomfort, and the feeling of incomplete evacuation after going to the bathroom. The straining that's involved can also lead to the development of hemorrhoids, which are swollen veins in the anus and rectum. Hemorrhoids typically add an extra layer of pain and discomfort to chronic constipation. They can also lead to bleeding and sometimes require surgery to repair. Another benefit of fiber I mentioned was its ability to prevent cholesterol reabsorption, and this image shows how that happens. The liver produces bile and secretes it into the small intestine to assist with fat digestion. Under normal circumstances, some of the components of bile, including cholesterol, get reabsorbed further along the digestive tract and are recycled to make more bile. However, this process is interrupted in the presence of fiber, which binds the cholesterol and causes it to be excreted in the feces. When cholesterol binding occurs consistently, the liver is forced to remove cholesterol from the blood to make more bile. Over time, that can lead to decreases in blood cholesterol, which is important because high blood cholesterol plays a significant role in the development of heart disease. So, when a product like Cheerios claims it can help lower cholesterol, it's because of this process. Alright, that concludes the second learning objective. Explain why carbohydrates are needed in the diet. Next, we'll discuss nutrition recommendations for carbohydrates. The first recommendation we're going to examine is for daily carbohydrate intake. The RDA for carbohydrates is 130 grams per day for adults and children older than 1 year. According to the National Academies, this recommendation is based on the average minimum amount of glucose the brain utilizes. A diet that provides less than the brain needs can produce effects like dizziness, difficulty concentrating, lethargy, and irritability. That is, unless there's chronic carbohydrate restriction that leads to a state of ketosis, which is unfortunately beyond the scope of this course. The National Academies also recommends daily carbohydrate intake within the AMDR of 45 to 65% of total calories. This recommendation is more useful because it provides a more individualized recommendation that optimizes carbohydrate intake rather than just meeting a minimum requirement. To see how the AMDR provides a more individualized recommendation, let's pretend we have two adult males who are both 40 years old, but have different calorie needs because of their differences in height, weight, and frame size. Mr. Smith needs 2,000 calories per day, and Mr. Rivera needs 2,800 calories per day. When you take 45 to 65% of that calorie requirement and divide it by 4 calories per gram, Mr. Smith has a carbohydrate need of 225 to 325, whereas Mr. Rivera has a higher need of 315 to 455. The total grams per day suggested by the AMDR would provide enough energy to fuel the adult brain, but it would also help to fuel physical activity and ensure adequate glycogen storage to support the blood glucose level between meals. Putting these numbers into perspective, we can look at the carbohydrate content of various foods and see that if Mr. Smith eats all of them in one day, he would easily be in the 225 to 325 gram range we found for his AMDR. As you can see, the best sources of carbohydrates include the following: grains and grain-based foods like bread and pasta, beans and lentils, starchy vegetables like potatoes and corn, fruit, and milk. Apart from milk, animal-based foods are very low carbohydrate or carbohydrate-free. Non-starchy vegetables, including broccoli, bell pepper, asparagus, green beans, onions, and mushrooms, among many others, contain some carbohydrates but not nearly as many as their starchy counterparts. The second recommendation for carbohydrate intake we'll look at is for added sugars. In the dietary guidelines for Americans, the recommendation is to limit added sugars to a maximum of 10% of total calories. Another relevant recommendation comes from the American Heart Association, which recommends limiting added sugars to a maximum of 100 calories for females and 150 calories for males. Using Mr. Smith's energy requirement of 2,000 calories per day as an example, limiting intake to 10% of total calories would be 200 calories or 50 grams. That amount would not apply to foods that naturally contain sugar, like fruit, but it would apply to foods where sugar is added in the food-making process, like soda or a candy bar. For reference, a 12-ounce can of Coca-Cola contains 39 grams of added sugar, and a Snickers bar contains 26 grams of added sugar. So, if Mr. Smith drank 1 can of Coca-Cola and ate 1 Snickers bar on the same day, he would exceed the recommended amount. Finally, the third recommendation centers around fiber. The RDA for fiber is 38 grams for males and 25 grams for females ages 19 to 50. After the age of 50, that decreases to 30 grams for males and 21 grams for females. The other relevant recommendation is from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which recommends that at least 50% of grains be whole grains. Whole grains are those that retain all of the edible components of the grain and are therefore fiber-containing. We'll see examples of that in just a moment. Before we do that, we can see all the components of the whole grain. There's the endosperm, which holds the starch, the germ, which contains oils, vitamins, and minerals, and the bran, where you find the fiber. Many of the grains in our food supply are processed to create refined grains, which strip the germ and bran and retain only the endosperm. Doing this extends the shelf life since the oils are prone to spoiling over time. It can also change the fiber and texture and make what many people find a more palatable final product. That's what happens when you turn brown rice into white rice. This graph demonstrates the nutrient loss that occurs in this process. As you can see, when you go from a whole grain to a refined grain, you lose a significant amount of vitamins, minerals, and fiber. Knowing that most people will choose refined grains over whole grains, the United States government has implemented enrichment standards, forcing manufacturers to add nutrients to their grains and grain-based products. However, enrichment doesn't cover every nutrient that's lost. Vitamins and minerals can be found in many foods, so losing them in grains isn't problematic for most people. However, missing out on fiber can be an issue since the other foods that contain it are typically underconsumed. That includes fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, and legumes. Many people receive whole grains by consuming whole wheat flour-based food products like bread, pasta, and crackers. Beyond wheat, other examples of whole grains include brown rice, oats, quinoa, corn, farro, and barley. I'm ending this section by leaving you with 5 tips for fiber intake. The first one is to choose whole grains and whole grain food products most of the time. You don't have to eat only whole grains to reach your fiber goal and maximize your health, but striving for more whole grains is an easy way to ensure you consistently hit your target amount. The second one is to select whole fruits instead of fruit juice. That's because the whole fruit contains fiber, and the juicing process takes the fiber out. Blending fruits in a way that retains the fiber, as you would when making a smoothie, is perfectly fine. The third tip is to consume generous servings of vegetables daily. That's because they're an excellent source of fiber in addition to all of the vitamins and minerals they provide. The fourth tip is to include beans, lentils, avocados, nuts, and seeds in your diet because they're all high-fiber foods. And the fifth and final tip is to drink plenty of water to minimize the risk of constipation. Even though fiber adds bulk to the stool and eases elimination, having too much of it can have the opposite effect, especially if there's insufficient water to absorb. Okay, that completes the third learning objective. Discuss nutrition recommendations for carbohydrates. We'll close out Chapter 4 by exploring the basics of carbohydrate metabolism, emphasizing digestion, absorption, and storage. For carbohydrate digestion, the goal is to break disaccharides and starch down into monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are the only carbohydrates absorbed by the intestinal cells, so converting them into this form is a critical step in allowing the body to use glucose for energy. Out of all the carbohydrates, starch requires the most digestion. After all, it consists of very long strands of glucose. Starch digestion begins in the mouth with chewing and an enzyme in saliva. Then it stops in the stomach, and it resumes in the small intestine via enzymes from the pancreas and intestinal cells. Unlike starch, disaccharides only need to be split once before they can be absorbed. No digestion occurs in the mouth or stomach. The splitting of disaccharides occurs in the small intestine via enzymes from the intestinal cells. After starch and disaccharides are broken down into monosaccharides, the monosaccharides are absorbed in the small intestine. They pass through the intestinal cells and travel in the blood to the liver via the hepatic portal vein, which connects the liver to the digestive tract through a network of smaller blood vessels. Once they arrive at the liver can convert fructose and galactose to glucose. Fiber passes through the small intestine unabsorbed and ends up in the large intestine, serving as food for the intestinal bacteria. This creates a situation of some indirect absorption because the intestinal bacteria produce nutrients that can be absorbed by intestinal cells. To summarize, we can think of carbohydrate digestion and absorption in a series of 4 steps. First, the process begins with eating carbohydrate-rich foods that contain monosaccharides, disaccharides, starch, and fiber. Second, chewing food breaks down some of the starch and fiber, and enzymes in the saliva separate some of the bonds holding glucose molecules together in the starch. Third, carbohydrates pass into the stomach, where no digestion occurs. And fourth, carbohydrates enter the small intestine, where enzymes from the pancreas and intestinal cells reduce starch and disaccharides to monosaccharides. These monosaccharides then enter the intestinal cells and find their way into the blood to go directly to the liver. Fiber is not broken down further in the small intestine and passes into the large intestine, where it carries out numerous functions, one of which is to serve as food for intestinal bacteria. Once glucose is in the body, it's used for energy or to create sugar-protein complexes. Any glucose that's not immediately needed is stored for later use. Excess glucose is stored as glycogen in the liver and skeletal muscle. An important thing to know about this is that glycogen storage in the body is limited. In other words, the liver and skeletal muscle can only hold so much of it before they're at capacity. Once glycogen storage is saturated, the liver turns excess glucose into fat, making sure the available energy doesn't go to waste. If total energy intake is excessive, the body stores fat in adipose tissue, which is the fat under the skin and between the internal organs. That storage is virtually unlimited, which becomes an issue when excessive energy intake becomes chronic. So, once the carbohydrates we eat enter the body, most of the fructose and all of the galactose is turned into glucose. Most of that glucose goes to energy production in cells throughout the body. Once the capacity for glucose usage is filled, whatever is left in the blood will be shuttled into the storage pathway to be kept as glycogen in the liver and skeletal muscle. Only when the capacity for glycogen storage is filled do we begin to see excess glucose being turned into fat. In Chapter 3, we saw what glycogen does when we examined blood glucose regulation as an example of the hormonal system. Insulin sends glucose into the liver after meals to store it for later use, and glucagon breaks it down between meals, releasing it from the liver to be used as energy. Muscle glycogen cannot be released between meals to maintain blood glucose levels. It's reserved for moderate to vigorous intensity exercise to satisfy the increased demand for energy the exercise presents. That completes the fourth and final learning objective. We explored the basics of carbohydrate metabolism, emphasizing digestion, absorption, and storage. If you want to check out parts of the chapter that weren't covered, here are the sections I recommend.